Good morning, guys. This is the second time I've done this video. I just spent a little over an hour doing a video only to find upon playback that the audio was not properly set up. So here I go again. I hope that I do a better job on uh, opportunity 2 because I think I probably was not as smooth in my first lecture as I should have been. I just want to take a moment to welcome you guys to the online video that I'll be using throughout the rest of the semester to allow us to finish the semester online. I know that none of you signed up for an online class, and so I hate that we are having to move a face-to-face class to the online mode of delivery. It's been a while since I've taught an online class, and so bear with me. I've never used video, so this is new all around. I appreciate you guys being flexible, working on the exam this week while I tried to continue getting ready for this. I've had some internet problems as I've relayed to you guys, so I just want to thank you again for being patient enough to let me work through these issues. So let me go ahead and jump into Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is called Social Stratification, and we're going to talk about different types of stratification, different systems of stratification. We're going to talk about social mobility and different types of social mobility. We live in a class system here in the United States, and so that's a little bit different from some of the other stratification systems that we'll talk about. So, of course, we'll talk about the sociological perspectives and how they all view social stratification. The question is posed by the author of your textbook, is stratification necessary? Is it avoidable? Is there something we can do to do away with stratification? And the reality is I think that stratification will probably always exist, but we can minimize it. There are some societies that do a better job of distribution of access to resources than we do here in the United States. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But we here in the United States live in a capitalistic society, and that means that corporations are owned for profit, and people are trying to make money and trying to achieve upward social mobility. And so there's nothing wrong with that. That's capitalism, and capitalism is an awful system, except when you compare it to every other economic system in the world, and then it starts to look a lot better. I like capitalism, but I don't like unfettered capitalism, so we'll talk about some of these issues. Let's go ahead and talk about what we mean by inequality and stratification. I sent or posted the Chapter 8 PowerPoint, so that's available to you guys. You can open that up and perhaps print it out and look at it as you're going through and listening to my lecture here on online. But let's do whatever we need to do to learn what we need to learn from Chapter 8. So we're going to talk a little bit about social inequality. Our textbook defines social inequality as a condition in which members of society have different access to prestige, wealth, or power. We need to note that there is some inequality in every society, but certainly in some there's more than in others, and so we'll talk about that. Stratification is defined by our author as a structured ranking of entire groups of people that perpetuates unequal economic rewards and power in society. And it has a pervasive influence on human interactions and institutions. And that's certainly what we have here in the United States. People who are very wealthy can afford to send their children to private school. Then once they graduate from private education, then they can afford to send them to an Ivy League university, a very prestigious university. That may not be an option for lower class families. In fact, in many lower class families, it's definitely not an option. So we're going to talk about these different social classes and different types of stratification worldwide. So let's get some terms out of the way. First of all, we want to just define income, and we know that income is our salary and wages We can also derive income from investments. If we have rental properties, when people pay us rent every month, that is part of our income. If we have stocks and bonds and other kinds of investments, the money that we get from those on a monthly or quarterly or yearly basis would fit into the category of income. But when we talk about wealth, now we're talking about more than just how much money you earn in your job and from your investments. We're talking about the value of those investments themselves. So it's not just stock dividends, it's the dividends and the stock. And so if we took someone's total possessions and we liquidated that, in other words, we sold all of that for cash, and we paid off all their bills, what was left would be their wealth. And for many American families, about half of American families, they have no wealth. And so we'll get into some specifics of the numbers and everything. But the top 1 to 2% in our society have tremendous wealth. They have about a little over a third of the total wealth of the country. And the top 10% have about 50% of the wealth of the entire country. So we'll look at some of these numbers here. Maybe in the next lecture. Probably won't get to that today. What I'd like to talk about today is just the different caste systems and estate systems and class systems and slavery. Talk about those 4 different systems of stratification, and then the sociological perspectives and how they view it. And that'll probably be enough to get us through today's lecture. So, as I mentioned, there are 4 general systems of stratification, slavery being one, the caste system being another, the estate or feudalism, estate system or feudalism being the third, and then social classes being the 4th one. So I want to start out by talking about some different types of statuses. There are ascribed statuses and achieved statuses. An ascribed status is a status into which you're born. So being male or female is an ascribed status. You're born into that. And, for most of us, we can't change that and wouldn't want to change that. Our race is an ascribed status. But there are also some achieved statuses, and we need to be aware of those as well. Achieved statuses are things that you earn or acquire on your own efforts. So being a high school graduate is an achieved status. Being a member of the Honor Society is an achieved status. Being a member of the upper middle class, if you grew up in a working class family, that's an achieved status. And so it's important that we look at ascribed statuses and achieved statuses because that kind of tells us what kind of system we're in. If we're in a system where somebody can be born into a lower class and move up, or be born into a higher class and move down, then we would consider that to be a social class system that's based on merit and achieved statuses. If, on the other hand, we're in a society where the group that we're born into is the group that we will belong to throughout our lifetime, then that is going to be a system of slavery or a caste system, or it could be the estate system, because in all of those there is very limited mobility, and in some there's virtually no mobility. Okay, so let's start talking just a little bit about slavery as a system of stratification. And of course, we know that slavery involves a situation where people are owned by other people and they're treated as property. They can be bought and sold, they can be split up from their loved ones and things of that nature. So slavery is a system that does not provide anybody who is a slave much opportunity. Yes, there are situations where generous slave owners, if we can call them that, where slave owners might be generous enough to allow people to earn their freedom at some point, but those are exceptions rather than the rule. Okay, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights prohibits slavery in all of its forms, and yet, even though almost every nation in the world has signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we know that some countries do still tolerate and allow slavery. As a matter of fact, in terms of actual numbers, there are more slaves today than at any time in our history, so that's something to be aware of. Slavery may look a little different than it did 100 years ago, but it still does exist, and it is present all around the world. Even here in the United States, we have people who are, through human trafficking, who are forced to work in sweatshops or in the sex industry, and they are not really compensated for that, and they don't have any ability to decide to get out of that. And so that's what we mean by slavery. In many developing countries, bonded laborers are imprisoned in virtual lifetime employment. And so slavery is still a fact of life in much of the world. But there are some countries that are trying to stop human trafficking and prevent slavery. And we'll get into that here in just a minute. We also have guest workers here in the United States and in some European countries who are in forced labor under some pretty harsh conditions. Okay. So in 2000, the year 2000, Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that does allow us to monitor and track what other countries are doing, as well as the United States are doing, to try to eliminate human trafficking. And we've established some minimum standards in terms of what it means to eliminate human trafficking. So if you look at the table, I think it's on slide 11 or so. In our PowerPoint, you've got 4 different categories. The United States is in Tier 1 with a number of other developed nations such as Australia, Chile, Germany, Norway, South Korea, and a number of other countries are in Tier 1. They're in full compliance, and they're doing a lot to try to prevent human trafficking. Tier 2 countries are making some significant efforts. Afghanistan, Greece, Lebanon, South Africa, Ukraine are all examples of countries that are in the Tier 2 category. Then you have the Tier 2 watch list, and these countries are, there are significant concerns regarding their efforts. They don't seem to be making as much effort as we'd like them to make to eliminate human trafficking. And then you've got the Tier 3 countries. Let me give you a couple of those countries from Tier 2. You've got Algeria and Burma, Haiti, Kuwait, Pakistan, Thailand. Those are countries that are allowing human trafficking, and it is a concern there. And then you've got the Tier 3 countries that are pretty much non-compliant and are making no effort to reduce human trafficking, and that includes countries like Belarus, China, Russia, North Korea, Syria, Uzbekistan, and Venezuela. Okay. So if you're born into slavery, then it's very likely that you will die a slave, unless there's some change in the government, as we had, in the Civil War, where we had the Emancipation Proclamation, where Abraham Lincoln declared slavery, null and void, and we fought a war over that. So unless there's something like that, or somebody grants a person freedom, they don't really have any way of getting out of slavery. So that's what we mean by slavery as a system of stratification. If you're born a slave, you are very likely to die a slave unless something changes your status that's outside your control. In caste systems, of course, these are systems that again allow very little mobility upward and a little bit downward, unfortunately. Castes are hereditary ranks that are usually religiously dictated, and they tend to be fixed and immobile. In other words, you can't move from one caste to another. It's an ascribed status. You're born into a particular caste. You tend to marry within your caste. You don't marry into other castes. It's generally associated with Hinduism in India. That's really the primary caste system that you hear sociologists talking about. We know that the urbanization and the technological changes that have occurred in India are helping to reduce the impact of the caste system, but it is still there. There are still some vestiges of the caste system there. And you could say that after the Civil War, once slavery was no longer legal in the United States, but because of the Jim Crow laws and things that states in the South did to prevent full participation for African Americans in our political and economic system, that we really kind of had a caste system here in the United States after the end of the Civil War, up until probably about the time of the Civil Rights Movement, beginning in the 1950s. So from 1865 until around the 1950s, or even the 1960s, we saw that African Americans were significantly disadvantaged in the South, and you could consider that to be kind of a caste system. Because there were really very limited opportunities for African Americans in the South after the end of the Civil War. So let's talk a little bit about estate systems. And when we think about medieval times in Europe, that's kind of what we're thinking about. We have a monarch, a king, and the king has a queen, and they have dukes and earls who oversee their lands, and they are the landed aristocracy. And then you have the peasants who are out there farming the land. The land doesn't belong to the peasants, it belongs to the king, and so they are giving taxes. They are paying many of their crops to the monarch in exchange for the privilege of being allowed to live on the land and be protected from other countries who might have invading armies. And so you have the peasants and you have the landed aristocracy. The royalty, and you don't move from being a peasant to being, part of the royal family unless you have some characteristics that are deemed to be of value to the royal family. So it's also referred to as feudalism. The inheritance of one's position is defining of the estate system. You're either born a peasant or part of the royalty. We know that by the 12th century, the priesthood and merchants who were, providing goods to the populace by engaging in trade with other countries and other groups, and then selling those goods to the locals, created a middle class and really kind of helped lead to the end of the estate system. So today, yes, there's still a king or a queen in the UK. Right now it's the Queen. But she really is a figurehead. She doesn't have a tremendous amount of power. You have Parliament and the Prime Minister of England, and they have a great deal more power in terms of being able to make laws and things of that nature. So it's really not a feudal system anymore. It's more of a class system in the UK. But you can still see some vestiges of or remains of the old feudal system in terms of having a royal family and people having titles and things of that nature. Okay. And then lastly, we have class systems, and a class system separates people on the basis of certain criteria, but there is movement. Okay, so a class system is a social ranking system that's based primarily on the economic position that people are born into and are able to achieve on their own efforts. There is some social mobility in a class system. Different class systems have different levels of mobility, and we'll talk about that. Our class standing is heavily dependent upon both family and ascribed factors. In other words, things that we're born with that we don't have the ability to change. But the boundaries are not real precise. In other words, it's kind of hard to tell if somebody is lower middle class or upper middle class just by looking at their lifestyle. But if we look at their education, their occupational prestige, as well as some other factors, we can sometimes make some distinctions, but the lines are not real thin. They're kind of blurry and broad, and it's kind of hard to tell when somebody moves from one social class to another. These social classes, are marked by uneven distribution of power and wealth. Okay. Here in the United States, we typically identify 5 different social classes. Some sociologists will say that there's 6 or even 7 classes. Our textbook talks about the Rosita's categorization scheme that has 5 social classes. You've got the upper class. That's one class, but some sociologists will divide that into the upper and the lower upper class. And whether somebody is in the upper class or the lower upper class depends not so much on how much money they have or wealth they have, but rather on how long they've had that money. Upper class people tend to be what we call the old money, and the lower upper class might actually have more money, but because they've had their money a shorter period of time, we consider them to be the newly rich, and therefore they're the lower upper class. Then we have the middle class, and they're divided into the upper middle class and the lower middle class. Beneath them you have the working class, and beneath them you have the lower class. And then some people say that you can divide a segment out of the lower class and call them the underclass. And the underclass is a group of the lower class who have been poor for generations. So it's persistent poverty, and in many cases people in the underclass don't really see a lot of reason to try to get out of their economic predicament because it's become so ingrained in them that I grew up poor, my parents were poor, my grandparents were poor, there's no hope, and they in many cases they kind of give up. If you remember, there was a video, we might have watched it in class, but if not, it's online. It's a video where this guy's telling students, you know, I'm going to have you run a race, and if you win the race, you win the $100 bill. And then he says, before we start the race, those of you who, you know, parents are still together, take 2 steps forward, and those of you who've never had to worry about whether your cell phone was going to get cut off, take 2 steps forward. And by the time he asks them, you know, 5 or 6 questions, you've got a group of students who are already halfway to the finish line, and you look at those people back at the starting line, and they really don't have a chance to win the race. So when he says to go, nobody at the starting line, hardly anybody at the starting line even tries, because they know that the people who are already halfway to the finish line are going to beat them for the $100. So I kind of think of that group that stayed at the starting line as kind of representing what it means to be a part of the underclass in our country, where you just don't see any opportunity to improve your family's lives, and so you kind of give up. So let's talk about each of these classes. We'll start out with the upper and the lower classes, and we'll talk about them together. So the upper class is comprised of about 1 to 2% of the population. They are the very, very wealthiest in our society. The lower class is a much larger group. It's about 20 to 25% of the population, and it's disproportionately comprised of African Americans, Hispanics, single mothers with dependent children, and people who are struggling to find regular work. They typically don't have any political power. They're just too politically weak to exert any political power, which in opposition to the upper class, you know, the upper class has a tremendous amount of wealth and power. They can vote. They can give money to specific candidates. They can give money to political action committees. They can run for office. They can pay lobbyists to go to Washington and try to get legislators to pass legislation that's in their best interest. So the wealthy have a tremendous amount of power, and the lower class has very, very little political power. Ascribed statuses are very important here because we see that race and things like disability can influence the wealth that we grow up with and our social position in society. We know that the rich are some of the most noticed but the least studied people, and they don't really want to be studied. They don't really want too much attention. A lot of wealthy people kind of keep a low profile. We don't really know a lot about what their lives are like. I just read an article today that said that wealthy New Yorkers are leaving New York City and going to their summer homes, which is angering a lot of people who are stuck in New York City right now in the midst of this pandemic. So, again, even in something like, can you get in your car and drive to a summer home where you can be isolated from people who are infected with a very serious virus? That depends on your status and your position in the social stratification system. Okay, so we know that at the end of 2016, over 156,000 households in the United States were worth more than $25 million each. And so the wealth of the very wealthy is growing, and unfortunately the wealth of those in the lower classes is virtually non-existent. Let's talk a little bit about the middle class. The middle class is comprised of 2 groups. We said the upper middle class is an important part of that, and they make up about 10 to 15% of the population. The lower middle class is larger. It's about 30 to 35%. So when we put them together, we're talking about somewhere between 40 and 50% of the population. If I ask you guys, or when we ask people, what social class do you belong to, about 80+% will say that they belong to the middle class, and we know that 80% can't be in the middle class. Statistically, that just doesn't work. But about somewhere around 40 to 50% of our population is in the middle class. Most of them in the lower middle class. Well, you might want to know, well, what makes the lower middle class different from the upper middle class? It has a lot to do with the level of education and the quality of the education, or at least the prestige associated with the education, as well as the prestige of the occupation. Okay, so if someone's in the upper middle class, they almost certainly have a baccalaureate degree. They may even have an advanced degree, such as a master's or an EDD or a PhD, and it may be from a fairly prestigious university. Perhaps even a private school or like an Ivy League school. Okay, a lower middle class person probably has a baccalaureate degree, but it may be from a state school, a public university like the University of Texas, or Texas A&M Commerce, or UTA, or North Texas up in Denton. They have a fair level of education. They could even have a master's degree, but again, it's probably going to come from a less prestigious university. And they are going to make a little less money. They have less occupational prestige, and in general, they have a little less education than those in the upper middle class. Okay, so the upper middle class are going to engage in things like medicine. You're going to have doctors and lawyers and upper mid-level management people in corporations and things of that nature. In the lower middle class, you're going to have more nurses and more radiology techs and college professors and teachers and maybe police officers, if you're in an area where police departments want their officers to have at least a baccalaureate degree. So we're talking about people who make a little less money, have a little less occupational prestige, and have a little less status in society than the upper middle class. Okay, they are professionals, but they are less affluent professionals. So let's talk a little bit about the working class. This class makes up 40 to 45% of the U.S. population. They hold manual labor type jobs, blue collar jobs, factory workers, plumbers, and things of that nature. They can make significant amounts of money if they are very skilled in their job. So master electrician would be considered working class, even though he may make more money than someone who lives in the who is in the lower middle class, but lives in a more prestigious neighborhood perhaps, or has a little more education. Okay, to be a master electrician or a master plumber, you don't necessarily have to have a college degree, but you do have to have additional training, and you have to pass some certification tests. There are some credentialing issues that you have to take care of to become a master plumber or a master electrician. Or if you're going to be a truck driver, you have to go to truck driving school and pass a test to drive commercial vehicles. But a truck driver can make $80,000 or $100,000 a year. Master plumber or electrician can make over $100,000 a year, but they don't have the same level of occupational prestige that a school teacher who makes maybe $55,000 a year might have. Okay. The jobs that are available to the working class are changing. We've seen a lot of manufacturing jobs being shipped overseas over the last few years, and so today we see more service occupations and technical jobs becoming available, and fewer manufacturing jobs available. So we're seeing the industry changing. The coal mines are beginning to close down. Factories that use coal as a source of energy are beginning to be converted to other kinds of energy sources and things of that nature. So the demand for coal is diminishing. And that puts a strain on the society when you go through those kinds of technological changes. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the class conflict that exists in our society today. The Occupy Wall Street movement tried to highlight the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And there you had members of the so-called 99% who were protesting against the wealthiest 1%, who really have done very well for themselves, not entirely due to their own efforts in a lot of cases. Sometimes we change tax laws and reduce regulations over different industries and things of that nature, and that can lead to millions and even billions of dollars into the hands of corporations and wealthy people. So political leaders are beginning to talk a little bit about class conflict here in the United States. A few decades ago, you just didn't hear much discussion about that. But because the gulf between the wealthy and the poor has widened over the last 50 years, largely due to tax policy and some of the changes that we've put into place in terms of the social safety net agencies, the Medicaid programs and food stamps, SNAP, and those kinds of programs, we see that the poor are really, really struggling. And they seem to be under almost constant attack by the media and the government because, even President Trump recently has been talking about reducing availability of food stamps and nutritional assistance and things of that nature. This is a very serious concern, particularly at a time when our nation is in crisis in terms of our economy. So very serious issues to deal with. Today, the rich are just about as likely as the poor to say that class conflict exists, so at least we've made some progress and people are willing to admit that we do have some income inequality and that there is conflict between the upper classes and the lower classes. In 2018, we had a survey that showed that about 63% of Americans believe that, there is some level of dissatisfaction about the way that income and wealth are distributed in our country. Okay, so 63% of our population in 2018 were unsatisfied with the way things are distributed in our society. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sociological perspectives on social stratification. And of course, nobody has had more to say about this than Karl Marx. Conflict theory says a lot about inequality. That's the whole basis of that perspective, is the inequality between the rich and the poor. And so, of course, he talked about the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat and, having tremendous power over the lower classes and all of that. And so he said that capitalism, which is defined as an economic system in which the means of production are held in private hands and the main incentive for activity is profits, he said that capitalism was a system that was going to lead to exploitation of the lower classes, of the proletariat, and that eventually he hoped that the lower classes would develop what he called a true class consciousness, and that they would then exert their political power to try to reduce the inequality that existed in society. But of course, we know that he believed that eventually we would have these bloody revolutions that would lead to socialism, and then eventually it would lead to communism, which he thought would be the ideal utopian type of government. And of course, we know that that's not the case. That communist economies have struggled. They've not been successful by and large. And those countries that consider themselves to be communist, that have experienced tremendous economic growth, such as China, which, China a few years ago was the 17th largest economy in the world. Today it's number 2. Well, it was before the virus, right? This number 2 economy in the world. But it wasn't because they were a communist society, a communist economy. It was because they started allowing the private investments and private wealth, and that has led to the growth of the Chinese economy. But generally speaking, if we look at communist countries, the former Soviet Union has fallen, Cuba is struggling, North Korea is in bad shape, economically. So I don't think we can say that communism has been a success in the countries that are most prominent as communist economies. But anyway, so Marx was talking about the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. He said that the lower classes will often develop a false consciousness. They'll believe that, well, if I just keep working a little harder, financial success can be mine. And he said that what really needs to happen is the development of a true class consciousness where people become aware that, it doesn't really matter how hard we work, how much we try to develop our skills, we're always going to struggle, and until society changes. And then they can become part of the process to try to reduce the inequality that exists in society. Well, so how accurate was Marx's predictions? Well, he really did not anticipate that unions would have the power that they had here in the United States and in some other countries. He advocated for unions, but he didn't think they'd be very successful, so he was certainly not accurate in his predictions for that. He also didn't see how much a little bit of prosperity and political liberties could lead to false consciousness. He thought that workers would become aware of the issues that they faced and become politically active. And we experienced some relative affluence after the end of the World War II. From about the late 1940s up and through the 1970s, a lot of people saw their family doing better, saw their families improving their lives, having better access to technology and better nutrition and things of that nature. And so people felt like things were improving, and therefore I think that kind of eroded this development of a true class consciousness as well. And then he also did not predict that the Communist Party would be formed and then be overthrown in the Soviet Union. So Marx was wrong about a lot of things, but I don't think that we should discount his theories as not having some value, even though some of his long-range predictions were not didn't come to pass. Okay. So let's move on and talk a little bit about Max Weber. Now, if we think about Marx, he based class position entirely on somebody's economic well-being, right? You're either the owner of a business or you work for someone who owns a business. So you're either part of the bourgeoisie or you're part of the proletariat. Max Weber said there's more to it than that. It's not just about economics, that prestige and the people that you hang out with, those are all important as well, and that determines your social standing just as the amount of money that you make in your weekly or monthly check helps to influence your social class. So according to Weber, class is a group of people who have similar levels of wealth and income, but there are also some lifestyle things that we need to take into consideration as well when we assign someone to a different socioeconomic status. So he talked about things like status groups, and he said that status groups are people who have similar levels of prestige and similar lifestyles. And he said that individuals can gain status through membership in desirable groups. So if you belong to the Rotarians, Rotary Club, or Kiwanis, or some of those other civic business-minded groups, that can lead to a higher level of status within the community. He also talked about power as being the ability to exercise one's will over others, and he said that power can come from being a member of a powerful group, an influential group. And so sometimes being on the city council and having relationships with other people on the city council, plus people who are members of the Chamber of Commerce, that can give an individual power. They can go to those people and say, look, I have an issue here that I think is important and we need to resolve it. And if they agree with him or her and they want to support that individual, then that person gets some power and is able to bring about some changes that they think might be necessary. Okay. Conflict theorists say that big business and government are interrelated and are the major sources of power. It'd be hard to argue that today if you think about all the politicians who are leaving politics and going into industry as lobbyists, or if you think about the number of lobbyists and leaders of different organizations who are now being recruited into the government, those people all are interrelated and interconnected, and they have a tremendous amount of power, and they are exerting that power to improve their position in society. So our position in a stratification system reflects a combination of class, status, and power, and of course economics certainly plays a role in that, but it's not the only factor that's important. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the interactionist approach, and they're going to talk a little bit about how people who grow up in different classes grow up looking at life in different ways. You know, I've told the story of when my dad would go to meet the teacher night at the school. He would tell the teacher, if he gives you any trouble, you know, you paddle him and then you call us at home and we'll take care of him at home. That's a very working class kind of mentality. When middle class parents meet the teacher, they're going to ask more questions about, you know, how is the student performing in class? What can I do to help them be more successful? You know, they don't ask as many questions about behavior because they just look at things in a different way, and they assume that their student is behaving, although they may not be. They assume that their student is behaving, and their focus is on academic performance, not behavior. Okay. So that's just one in a many examples of how different social classes see things differently because of their growing up in different social class families. Okay, so Thorsten Veblen talked about this concept of conspicuous consumption, and he said that he defined conspicuous consumption as purchasing goods not to survive, but rather to flaunt their superior wealth and social standing. And so someone who's engaging in conspicuous consumption wants to buy name brand things. They want to buy the Mercedes or the BMW. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who goes out and buys a BMW is trying to show off for their neighbors and their friends and things of that nature. But if you think about, you know, what would motivate a person to go and buy a $10,000 used Rolex when they can go to the store and buy a $10 Timex that, you know, will perform just as well and tell them the time? It's all about the status that's associated with the Rolex, right? The Timex doesn't elevate you in anybody else's eyes. I used to use the example, if I drove to campus in a Mercedes or in a Lamborghini, let's go with a Lamborghini, you know, a $200,000 Lamborghini, students are going to look at me a little bit differently than when I roll into the parking lot in my Hyundai. Okay. So when we start doing things, we take vacations and we post all these wonderful pictures of our vacations to try to make our friends envious. That might be not just conspicuous consumption, that might be conspicuous leisure, okay, which is kind of a similar term. So if we're buying a car, not because we just need a piece of transportation from point A to point B, but because we want people to see that car and be impressed by the fact that we can afford that car, that would typically be conspicuous consumption. And if we're traveling around the world and we're documenting our travels in such a way that we can make all of our friends and maybe some of our enemies envious of us, then that might be conspicuous leisure. And they call it Facebook envy also, and things of that nature. So, you know, people who are very status conscious will engage in some conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure. Okay. Inequality exists in all societies. Now, it does vary. Here in the United States, we have a tremendous amount of stratification and inequality between the upper and lower classes. In other societies, they may have less, and certainly in communist societies, there's less, but there's still, even in a communist society, people who are members of the Communist Party have access to things that the rest of society do not have access to, and therefore there is inequality there as well. Okay, it's not as pronounced as in a capitalistic society, but there's still inequality. So I think it would be hard to ever get rid of social stratification and inequality. I can't imagine a society that could completely get rid of it, because someone always has to be in charge of seeing who gets what resources, who gets nutritional assistance, who gets housing. And when you put people in charge, automatically you're going to have stratification. Somebody has power over other people because of their position. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to conceive of a society where we could totally eliminate stratification. But society doesn't have to be as stratified, and we don't have to have as much inequality as we currently have in our society today. Now, the functionalist, let's talk about the functionalist. We've talked about conflict and the interactionist. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the functionalist. And we're going to see that some functionalists will say that, well, wait a minute, stratification is actually beneficial in some ways in society, because if everybody was compensated the same no matter what job they did, why would anybody spend 8 years going to college and then to medical school and then spend a couple of years of internship, perhaps, or a year of internship, and then a couple of years or 3 years of residency as to become a doctor, if they're going to make the same amount of money as someone who works as a sanitation worker or a factory worker or something like that? And it makes sense. It does make sense that stratification can motivate people to do things that are highly rewarding, but also require a lot of years of research and study and investment in terms of tuition and all of those kinds of things. So it does make sense that some jobs just wouldn't get done if we didn't have some level of stratification. But I think even many functionalists would agree that you don't have to have the level of stratification we have in our society in order to get those jobs done. So it doesn't explain this huge disparity between the rich and the poor, just saying that, well, that's how we get things done in society. And I do want to point out that having a large pool of underemployed or unemployed people means that you're always going to get dirty jobs in society done. So you've got important jobs at the top of the structure, like brain surgeon and things of that nature, but you also have important jobs at the other end of the spectrum that are not nearly as prestigious and don't pay as well, but they are important. A sanitation worker provides a very important function in society. If you've ever been in a city when they were having a sanitation worker strike, after about 3 days of trash rotting on the sidewalks and not being picked up by the sanitation workers, the city becomes almost unlivable. Rats and other vermin start to get into the trash and tear it up, and stray dogs and animals get into it, and it starts to stink and rot, and it becomes very undesirable very quickly. So sanitation workers are certainly important to us, but because it's not a position that requires tremendous skill, it's not compensated very well, and it is really devalued in our society. Even though they do perform very important functions. Like I said, I've been in New Orleans when they were having an issue with the sanitation workers there, and it was unlivable. It really was. So critics of the functionalist approach would say that you don't have to have the radical inequality that we have to motivate people. There were doctors before doctors started making very much money. You had doctors who would take care of people in a small village or small town for very minimal economic rewards. They might be paid by receiving a hog or some chickens or something like that if they perform services for somebody who was a farmer and couldn't afford a lot of cash to pay their bill. And so doctors used to go into medicine not to get wealthy, but to perform a function. It was still a prestigious occupation, even when it wasn't very well compensated. They were respected and valued by communities. And a lot of times, not only did they serve the humans in the community, but they might also serve, to go down and be a veterinarian for somebody who had a sick cow or something. So they were very valued members of society. But they were not particularly well compensated. That's been a more recent development, okay? So let's think a little bit more about the conflict approach. We know that The conflict approach is going to focus on the Marx's work and the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. They're going to talk about that continuous struggle between the wealthy and the poor, and exploitation and all of those kinds of things. Hang on just a second.